Mrs. Stolfus, did there come a time where you caught Erik copying from another child's work?
Yes, it was clear that he had copied from the other student. I showed the papers and I said, "You cheated. You copied this." And he began to cry.
Okay. A few tears?
No, he really cried.
Okay. Was the crying that you saw unusual behavior for a 15 or 16-year-old ninth grader, even one who's just been confronted with a paper they copied?
I have rarely seen a boy of that age cry over anything.
Erik's report, he read his report from note cards, and the vocabulary was, he had trouble pronouncing some of the words, didn't seem to understand what was behind some of the sentences, and so I felt it was not his own work.
Okay. And did you, at some point, discover a book with the same oral report that Erik had given?
Yes, he had copied it word for word from the World Book.
Mrs. Howarth, was copying word for word from a World Book encyclopedia a particularly clever way of not doing your own work?
It was not devious. That was one of the reasons that I felt that we should handle this situation with the head of upper school. He didn't change the word order. He didn't substitute vocabulary for words that he didn't know. He didn't omit.
It doesn't take a rocket scientist or a PhD to draw the connection between early childhood trauma, long-term child abuse, and sexual exploitation leading to juvenile delinquency, antisocial behaviors, learning difficulties, and academic failure. The severe, multifaceted, and long-term abuse these boys suffered easily explains the burglaries they were engaged in when they finally started making friends in high school and college, as well as Lyle and Erik both plagiarizing homework for school, which is something that is even very common among young students who are not abused. I can prove that it's also the parents' fault that they plagiarized. The burglaries, however, were not the brainchild of Erik and Lyle. They were inspired by their delinquent friends who had the code to the safe of their other friends' parents. Lyle and Erik were new to town, so these were people the brothers were not used to associating with because they went so long without friends. So the brothers likely did all they could to fit in with this group and be accepted by them. Dramatized shows like Monsters always take the image of the boys from their high school and college years when they had finally made friends and when they were super attractive and try to paint them as these overconfident, obnoxious, rich jocks, when in truth, testimony from their teachers, relatives, and coaches about the years preceding 1989 paints a much different picture. The plagiarism in school could also easily be explained by the brutal sports schedule their father forced them to keep, making them come to school late some days, wearing tennis clothes, because they were literally forced to practice tennis before and after school.
He was also not happy when I had to chastise him a number of times for coming in late every single morning. We had an 8:20 class, and he was never on time. He would come in at about 8:35 in his tennis outfit with his racket and his tennis bag. In fact, I don't think I ever saw Lyle Menendez at PDS in anything but tennis shorts, ever.
And did you, in June of 1984, in your comments indicate that Lyle was having difficulty due to absences and athletic responsibilities?
That's exactly what I've written, yes.
Was that referring to his tennis practices?
Yes.
Was that interfering with his schoolwork, in your opinion?
Yes.
Was there something unusual about the schedule that he kept?
Well, the class met first period, and I always saw him coming in a bit late. And at first that bothered me, and then I realized that that was the way things were in his house.
And what do you mean that's the way things were in his house?
I just, when I first approached him the first few times, it was evident that it was no fault of his that he was late.
How would he be dressed when he came in?
Tennis clothes.
Is this the way the other children dressed?
No.
And how did he look? Was he well groomed or? Did he look like he'd been doing something else before he got there?
He was clean, but sometimes his hair wasn't combed. He was always with tennis clothes, even when it was cold.
And did you learn that he played tennis in the morning before he came to school?
We knew that tennis was a very big part of his day.
Were sports a source of pressure?
He played on the tennis team in the spring. He certainly put a lot of time into practice. One of my comments, I warned him because he had had a marvelous second quarter, and then the third quarter began to slide away a little bit, and I said, you know, be sure you don't let the pressures of the tennis season get in the way of your academics.
Was that in your comment?
That was in my comment,
in
yes.
April of 1986?
That's correct.
And was that a comment that was written actually before the tennis season even began?
Probably on the verge of it.
It did.
Probably would have started.
Okay. And did, in fact, once the tennis season started, did Erik appear to have some added pressure on him because of his involvement in tennis?
His performance diminished.
When you said that Jose was demanding, what do you mean?
His methods. We took tennis lessons in the rain. I would see Lyle at 6 o'clock in the morning at our club practicing before school. There was one instance at least that I saw Lyle leaving the club at 11 o'clock at night that he and Mr. Menendez were working out on the court. I thought that was strange. I said, leaving already, sort of in a sarcastic way.
Now, did either of the brothers ever complain about their parents and the way they were being treated?
Just that they were tired.
Tired?
Yes.
Did you work them hard? Physically work them hard?
Very hard.
And tell me what the routine would be in terms of how you would work them.
Well, we generally practice for 2 hours in a row, and we wouldn't take any breaks, and we would not take water breaks, and I would run them nonstop for 2 hours, working every stroke.
And was that the way that Jose Menendez wanted them worked?
Yes.
By the way, this is in 1981 you began, correct?
Yes.
If Erik was born in 1970, he would have been 11 years old at that time?
Yes.
And if Lyle was born in 1968, he would have been 13?
Yes.
If you could explain to the jurors what was wrong, in your opinion, with the way that Jose Menendez wanted these kids coached?
I thought it was cruel.
I'm sorry?
I thought it was cruel.
Okay. How is it cruel?
Because they had to physically suffer.
Did the boys seem different out of the presence of their parents than they did in the presence of their parents?
Yes.
What was the difference?
They had no personality when they were with their parents. And when they were with me, they were nice, normal kids.
No personality in what sense?
They showed no emotion at all.
If you could you characterize the way the family was run based on your observations of the family during that 5-year period of time?
Yeah. It was run sort of like his business, and he would give the orders and they would follow them.
And are you literally saying he would give orders? Or
Yes.
How do you mean that?
Well, I mean, they would have tasks in practice, and they were written down, and they had to do it.
You would visit the Menendez home. Did you find this to be kind of a relaxed, easygoing, warm environment, or did you sense other emotions?
Other emotions at times, yes.
What other emotions did you sense?
I feel that Mr. Menendez ran his home as though it was a company and he was the chairman of the board. He's very strict with the boys. He wanted to have control in every aspect of their lives, either academically, socially, with tennis. The girls they decided to go, they wanted to go out with, the schools they selected, universities they selected.
Lyle said he was practicing up to 45 hours a week in addition to school. His coaches corroborated that he was practicing tennis with a schedule that was brutal for a boy his age.
And what about Mr. Menendez leads you to describe him as driven?
The amount of hours per week that the boys played and practiced, the amount of coaches they had at the same time. When I was working with Lyle, he had several coaches.
How were you aware that he was working a number of hours a week?
You mean with coaches or just playing?
Just playing.
Oh, because I saw it. He would play at our club several times a week, aside from working with me, and then practice, as I say, in the morning or in the evenings with Jose.
Okay, so approximately how many hours were you able to see him actually playing tennis a week?
I would say about 10 hours a week.
And is 10 hours a week an unusual or excessive amount of time for a 10-year-old to spend playing tennis?
Yes.
Do you have any opinion, or can you tell us why it isn't good for a 10-year-old to play tennis for 10 hours a week?
It shows a lot of burnout. Many kids burn out by the time they're 15. And plus, they don't have time to do other things that normal 10-year-old boys do.
How did you know they were physically suffering?
Because I knew how many hours a day they were doing.
And how many hours a day were they doing it?
All their free hours. And all day, both weekend days.
And was it your knowledge that they were playing tennis before they went to school in the morning sometimes?
Yes.
And did you coach them sometimes before they went to school?
Yes.
And what time would those kinds of lessons begin?
6 a.m., 6:30.
And was it within your personal knowledge that they were coached immediately after school?
Yes.
Was it within your personal knowledge that they were coached at night?
Yes.
And it was in your personal knowledge that they were coached all day long on each weekend day?
Yes.
So what free time did they have?
None. We even practiced on Christmas, holidays, every day.
And did you ever, in the times that you were at the home, see them with friends?
How do you think Lyle became the best tennis player in 5 states and was looking to become a national champion? It's because his father brutally abused, demeaned, and overworked him in sports from a very young age.
And it's a very low percentage, maybe 10%, do you actually hit a ball that the opponent can't touch.
And is it like in baseball where you hit a home run, basically?
Yes.
So he's teaching at that level. He
Right.
wants them to be hitting the home runs right from the beginning.
But on every shot. And when I tried to explain that to Mr. Menendez, he just sloughed it off and said, well, that's not the way we're going to do it.
Now, did this basic disagreement between the two of you last throughout the whole 5 years that you were coaching the boys?
Yeah.
And did it eventually end in you being fired by Mr. Menendez?
Yes.
Do you know why you got fired?
Because I stood up to him and I told him that he needed to back off because he was pushing them too hard and it was making them unhappy, and it wasn't that I had seen other students not make it because of this type of pressure, and that he should let me do the coaching and that he should just be the father.
Erik was being equally as pressured to become a great player and live up to the standards set by Lyle and his father. When on earth could they have had time for studying and learning in that case? Not to mention, the brothers' academic failures could also be explained by their learning disabilities, which were proven in their school records and testified to by their teachers, which they likely developed as a result of the severe physical and emotional abuse they experienced from birth, like constantly being smacked around. Both of them had problems hearing, so I don't think it's a coincidence that they had problem hearing and they were being smacked around all the time. They also had 2 unhinged, neglectful parents who would not get them help for their learning disabilities or test it for their hearing issues, which were brought to their attention by the teachers who testified. This is supported by school records.
Did Erik appear to belong at PDS academically?
Given his learning differences at that point, no.
Did you observe or come to recognize a learning difference as a result of your having taught Erik?
Yes, I did.
And what learning difference did you come to recognize?
He had massive auditory discrimination, auditory processing problems. And in fact, although we all told her, myself, over and over and over again, that this child needed some extra help, she denied it and would not provide it for him, despite the fact that she had all the resources at her fingertips. And this, to me, is a case of pure neglect.
I was concerned about his performance, so even though I did not worry that he was going to fail the course, I wanted to call to the parents' attention the fact that he was having difficulties more than normal.
Mrs. Howarth, was there ever any contact made by either of Erik's parents regarding the interim report that you made that was in October of 1985?
No, there was not. They did not respond directly to any of the comments that I made throughout the year.
Okay. You mean they didn't call you or try and talk to you about what you had written about their son?
That's correct.
Mrs. Stolfus, did you notice any learning problems that Erik had early on in your contact with him in 1985?
I recall saying in that very first comment in October that I noticed he seemed to get flustered taking written tests, and that it was my observation that he had a problem literally with the physical act of writing. It's a fancy term for it, is dysgraphia. He would have had to have been tested for that, which, as far as I know, he never was. But that his writing was quite bad, and it was literally painful to do it. And I concluded that perhaps one of the reasons that he particularly got disturbed at the time of taking a test was because of that.
And did there appear to you to be some difficulty, some learning difficulty on Erik's part?
It didn't occur to me until much later in the second semester that Erik had a reading problem, and I really only noticed it because it's typical of seniors especially to be able to compensate and to cover up for reading difficulties. There are all kinds of techniques that kids use to do that. But because it was a Shakespeare class, we did a lot of oral work, and quite a bit of it was sight reading. And Erik liked to take part because he enjoyed acting, and I noticed as he was reading that he was substituting words for what was actually in the text, using the right beginning sounds, but making up another word as he was reading, and that alerted me to the fact that he was having reading problems.
Okay. Is there a particular name for the reading problem that you observed with Erik?
Well, some people call it dyslexia, and I raised this point. I said I had the feeling that Erik had reading problems, that I hadn't noticed it as noticeably, but towards the end of the year it was, I felt strongly that there was a problem. And she said, oh yes, we know that. We had him tested when he was younger, and we were told that Erik was dyslexic. And I said at the time, I wish you had said something when enrolling Erik in the school. We might have been able to help him. But I really don't think so, because if it isn't handled early, by 12th grade, there's probably not much that a school could do anyway.
Okay, in other words, this reading dyslexia is something that you need intervention in remedial classes at a very early age.
Yes, I would say so.
And in the entry for November of 1983, which is the one right below the October entry, do you indicate that there seems to be a time delay between questions that you asked Lyle and his ability to register the sounds?
Yes, that's what I've written.
And did you, at that point, that is November of '83, recommend that Lyle have an auditory discrimination examination?
That's correct.
Do you know if he ever did that, or the parents ever did that?
I believe he did not.
Their academic failures could also be explained by them not having any real help with their studies and homework, because both parents were insane and abusive, so they had zero patience. Jose didn't even care about Erik's schooling, he only cared about Lyle. And Kitty abused Erik while he was trying to study because he wasn't studying in the exact way she wanted him to, despite knowing he had learning disabilities.
You talked before about your mother's tantrums or rages. Did your mother have tantrums or rages?
Yes.
And how far back do you remember seeing that kind of behavior by your mother?
Since I can remember.
Did they get worse as time went on? Say
Yes.
And what would she be like when she was in a rage?
She would just be completely out of control, screaming, grabbing things off counters and shelves and breaking them, throwing things around the house. Sometimes come after you, sometimes run away. Just a complete explosion. Just completely tense and
You just think-
ready to, explosion is the only word I can think, just ready to really, like she's trying to hold back and is not able. Yeah, she would use her fists against you, and her veins would bulge out and her face would clench.
You've heard people describe your mother when she was irrational and out of control, have you not?
Mm-hmm.
And they describe this grimace and the fists and that whole thing.
Yeah, she used to clench her fists and her whole face would turn red.
You've seen it. And you saw it over the course of your life?
Oh, yeah.
Her arms would flail. And she would just be out of control and she'd be running around. And you'd just be either hiding or I just stood there and not move. Sometimes Erik would run out of the room.
Would she speak louder than that?
She'd speak louder, and my mother cursed a lot. It was terrifying, and it was confusing. You just didn't know why. It'd just explode constantly. And you'd just be walking around the house like this because my mother could go off like that, and you could be hurt. She could throw things at you. Sometimes she'd grab me when I was little and hold me on the ground in awkward positions. Grab me upstairs and put me underneath her bed. You just never knew what was going to happen, so you were just scared, and you were just tense.
Would this be a punishment?
I don't know if you use the word punishment. These were just, you did these things on a regular basis when she exploded. And one of them was putting me under the bed.
What would it be like when she was helping Erik with his homework? And are we talking about Muncie now, your memories, or Pennington?
Pennington. He'd be writing, and she would just be watching like this. And as soon as he made a mistake, she'd take the paper and she'd go, "Do it again! Do it again!" She'd wait like about 10 seconds. And she'd grab the thing again, and she'd just crumple it up, and she'd slam it down again, and then she'd just start hitting. And just on the back of the head and his back, and he was supposed to keep writing. And I remember one time my dad walked in, and I don't think he had any idea sometimes that these things were going on in the house, because he was in shock. And my brother looked at him and he was crying, and I told him later that you got to do something for my mom.
The plagiarism also could be explained by their own parents setting this precedent for them when they were very young by doing the boys' homework for them, especially their Spanish homework. And this was at a time when the boys were far too young to have plagiarized for themselves. Their parents taught them how to plagiarize and taught them it was okay.
It was very difficult to get work completed in class from him. Written assignments were rarely completed if they were to be completed in class, but homework assignments eventually I would get from him, and the caliber of those assignments was much higher than anything he produced in class.
Now, in the records that are in front of you, exhibit number 199, could you take a look at the entry for October of 1983? I think it's the third page of the packet. Do you describe Lyle as having far superior written skills than he did oral skills in your class?
Yes.
And did you ever find out why that was?
I'm afraid that would be guessing.
All right.
Was there a problem that developed with regard to the quality of the work he did in class versus what he brought from home?
Yes, this class being a grammar and composition class, it was required of the students to read some very difficult literature, and I would ask them to write compositions. And the compositions that came back to me were wonderful. They were perfectly written. And every so often we'd have a grammar exam, and I could not really equate what went on in an exam versus the composition I was getting, which I would imagine would take a lot of critical thinking, a lot of knowledge in the language to be able to write that good of a composition. So in one of the parent-teacher conferences, I did bring it up to Joe and Kitty.
Now, when you say Joe and Kitty, is this Mr. and Mrs. Menendez?
Mr. and Mrs. Menendez, yes.
Is the short version of what you're telling us is that somebody else was doing the work that was coming from home besides Lyle?
Sustained.
Did you have an opinion as to whether Lyle was doing the work that was coming from home?
I had an opinion that there was no way that someone with the grammar knowledge that he had would be writing these compositions.
Let's focus on the homework first, okay?
Mm-hmm.
Did she supervise your homework?
Yes.
Did she on occasion do your homework?
Yes.
Did your father do your homework?
Sometimes.
The Spanish homework, for example.
Yes.
You heard Ms. Sharp testify that there was stuff being turned in that was very different than what was going on in class.
Yes, he
Who
would
was
do this.
Who was doing that?
My father.
And throughout your school career and in reading those comments, is it frequent that teachers have noticed that what was coming in from the home, essays particularly, was very different than your work on tests?
Well, it wasn't my work, so I think they noticed. I think they even commented to me sometimes about, they would do it in a sarcastic way about, your work at home is so good. Too bad you can't do that in class.
When Lyle was kicked out of school for plagiarizing, Jose wasn't upset with Lyle. He was upset with the school for punishing Lyle over something so petty.
And were you suspended from Princeton because you copied another student's work and turned it in as your own?
Yes.
And what was his reaction?
He didn't think I was even serious when I called him and explained him. I didn't want to call him. I was very nervous about it. My Aunt Terry said, "No, you got to tell your dad this is serious." And,
was he upset at the idea of you being thrown out of Princeton? Or suspended?
Oh, very much so, yeah.
Was he upset because you had cheated?
He didn't think that I had cheated. He basically thought it was a joke, and that they could jeopardize his son's life over a lab report was beyond his comprehension. And then when I got suspended, he was shocked and immediately flew to Princeton to meet with the president to get him to reverse it.
In fact, Jose was still doing Lyle's homework in either high school or college, I can't remember which, when he wrote this essay for Lyle that he turned in and got a bad grade on because the essay was basically just Jose's own philosophies and not based on the actual context of the philosopher they were studying.
And when you were in high school, who did your homework for you in high school?
You know, my mother did a lot of it. My dad wrote some of the papers if he wanted to, or my dad had somebody do them all at the end of the year, and I handed them in late and just got a half grade. But I seem to get a lot of leniency from the teachers because, I mean, of all the sports activities and all the things I was doing after school.
Was your dad doing some of the work for you in college?
Yes.
And would he decide which things he wanted to do?
Yes.
And did you turn in a paper based on a work by Machiavelli, a work called Prince?
Yes.
Looking at the contents of this paper, does it reflect certain philosophies which your dad discussed with you?
Oh, very
Almost exactly. I got a bad grade because he did it without the book. I had the book in New Jersey, and I kept telling him, you should buy a copy of the book. And he said, oh, no, I know all this.
And were you criticized because this was not truly a reflection of the book, but more a reflection of his own philosophy?
Yes, the teacher said that it was interesting, but that it was basically just my ruminations and not reflective of Machiavelli's actual work in The Prince.
And whose ruminations actually are contained in that paper?
My dad's.
So it is no wonder why they were both lost in their latter school years and both resorted to plagiarizing their work because their lack of academic help at home and their brutal sports schedules put them in an impossible position when it came to learning.